Hey everybody, welcome to the Baca County Museum. It's a pleasure to be here. We are streaming this live and recording, so hopefully some of those who had to work can catch this, because this is going to be a really great presentation this afternoon. We've got, and I didn't say that because I'm involved in the second one, just I'd like it duly noted on this video. But coming up first, we've got Mike and Chuck Bowen, who are going to talk to us about their Sand Creek book. I had the pleasure of talking to these gentlemen probably more than a year ago when they were beginning to put it together, and so I got a little bit of a sneak preview. Had the pleasure of I hope I gave them a little bit of guidance in terms of how to get started in terms of publishing the book. I know we had some really great conversations early on, and I think we're just in here for a real treat today. And so if you're out there in the Facebook land and you want a book, there's still time to come down to the Baca County Museum, check these guys out. They've got some books, they've got artifacts. We are going to chase this presentation of theirs with another one at 2 o'clock on some research I've done on some Baca County history. And so I guess without further ado, I'd love to welcome Mike and Chuck Bowen. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you to Kent, and it's a privilege to be here today. And I look around this room and I see most people that probably don't know who I am. I know at least one that does. My name is Mike Bowen, and I'm the son of Chuck and Sherry Bowen in Lamar. And I'm going to be here to help present and talk about the book I co-authored with my dad. We found the lost Sand Creek site, and this book details what they found, where they found the artifacts they did, how that changes or affects a traditional Sand Creek story. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about that with our book today. So I'm glad you're all here, and we hope you'll stay, get a book, get it signed, look at our artifacts. The artifacts that are here show a very small sampling of what my dad found at their Sand Creek site. So please stick around and take a look at those. It's a very, very, very big process that they went through to find what they did. So, but before we can really get to that idea and topic of we found the lost Sand Creek site, they found it. So what was lost? How was it lost? I'm going to get a little bit into that today. So that's kind of a relevant question. How did Sand Creek become lost? So a lot of what we know about the Sand Creek event, one major document comes 4 years after the Sand Creek event in 1868. There's a man named Lieutenant Bonsall that went out to the site, and he measured the distance of the camp. And he measured, and I've got a map here, a little hard to see, but you can see on this map there's what's called Three Forks, and then here is his camp number 2, and in between here is 6 miles from his camp to Three Forks, and then in between here is where the length of what he measured for the village. So again, and 4 years after the event, there would still be discernible things like burned teepee sites. So you'd be able to see things like that. So he could measure the length of the village. So this map is very important. This came out just 4 years after the Sand Creek event. So we can always reference back to this because some things start to get muddy shortly after 1868. But what we can see here, this map is just a strip map. It's not it's not just like a map you've heard to pull up on Google Earth or anything. It's just a strip map measuring distances. And that line is a dark line here, hard to see, a little bit harder to see, but it is in our book. And it's you can get a good picture of this in the book. It shows this map, but this line right here on the map represents 2.5 miles. That's what he measured as the length of the village. This is very important. We'll come back to this in just a minute. But this Three Forks is a very important reference point. So we measure back from that as well. And so a little bit after Sand Creek, though, things start to get kind of muddy because this map comes out, and it was nearly 30 years before the USGS topo map. And when this topo map came out in 1914, the map missed several things. A lot of things were more specific on the topo map, specific locations, bends in the creek. These became important landmarks now on this topo map. But one thing that topo map did not have, it did not mark the location of Black Kettle's village. It's not on the topo map. So by 1914, things are starting to get really muddy and things are becoming lost. And, at this point, and this is even after 4 soldiers went out to Sand Creek. In 1908, 4 veterans went out to Sand Creek to hold a reunion. They got off the train at Kit Carson, went down the creek, and we don't know for sure how far down the creek they went, but the 4 of them got together because they were determined to mark the spot, to go and just be able to historically mark the spot and document it where they fought on November 29, 1864 at Sand Creek. Well, believe it or not, each of these 4 veteran soldiers had a different spot. Not any 2 of the 4 could agree on one location. They each had a different spot and they could not agree. So this is interesting. But one thing that is important to know when it comes to Sand Creek is there's in testimony from Colonel Shivington after Sand Creek, he said that the village was, quote, on the south branch of the Big Sandy, or, quote, the Big Bend of the Sandy. So because of this, a lot of people thought that Sand Creek took place on the bend furthest to the south. So what you're going to find that bend furthest to the south is that's going to be what we call the traditional site, where there was a monument that sat there on a hill, and it sat there for a long time. In fact, this past March, the monument came down, but we don't really know why. They took the monument down, and the monument had read Sand Creek Battleground, so we don't know for sure the reason. Maybe some people didn't like how the wording was on that monument, but the monument came down, and so people believed that it was the bend furthest to the south because of what Colonel Shivington said. But we learned through research and discovery, and through looking where artifacts were found, we came to a conclusion, and we learned that when Shivington made those comments about Big Bend of the Sandy, he was talking about something quite different. And we get into that in a lot more detail in the book. And then also through research, there's another document, and it's actually multiple documents that are very important in Sand Creek discovery and research, and that's the George Bent letters. There's really nothing on the Arapaho or Cheyenne side that's written, but George Bent was half Cheyenne, and he lived among Black Kettle's village as a Cheyenne warrior. And later on in life, almost 40 years after Sand Creek, he worked as an Indian agent in Colony, Oklahoma. And during this time, he wrote letters to historians that were interested in learning about his Cheyenne way of life and his time at Sand Creek. And so they wrote letters back and forth, and they would ask him questions. And so we learn a lot about his time at Sand Creek through his letters. And one thing we learn through his letters, we learn about what they call the George Bent map. And you can see here, this George Bent map, it's a hand-drawn map, and it has a bunch of teepees on here, and it lists lodges, like those lodges that were at Sand Creek. And again, you can see a better, my pointer is actually not working, but you can see a better, clearer picture of this in our book. But you can see on there, but one thing that's important to note about this map, okay, so I'm going to come back to this, it's hand-drawn, and we can see from comparing to other maps, there's actually 2 sets of handwriting on a lot of his maps, and there's also fold marks on his map. So we can tell by the fold marks, the different handwriting, there's 2 people that actually worked on this map. So what's called the George Bent map was actually not made by George Bent, but by a historian named George Hyde, which we talk about more in our book. But there's also some other problems on this map. There's no legend, and so we don't know the distance. We have no idea of knowing the distance from the top of the map all the way across and through to the other side. We don't know how long that is. There's no legend on this map. And so that's one problem with this. Another thing we find is, I'm going to come back to that USGS topo map, because this George Bent map came out many years after that. And so we have come to the conclusion that George Bent's map was actually George Hyde's map, and it was traced from that USGS topo map, because it's a mere replica of it. And it looks just exactly like that topo map, and ironically also looks like that bend furthest to the south, which is that bend that goes by over where that monument sat at the National Park Service site. So this George Bent map is important, but it's actually the George Hyde map. And so they didn't.
Sorry,
we-
can I ask a question?
We will have time for questions after. I apologize, but I can answer any question after the program. So they did go with that concept, that theory that it was the bend furthest to the south. So that's why this map, when they traced it from the topo map, they traced that bend furthest to the south, which is why it looks so much like the bend by the monument. And so that is one of the reasons why that monument was even placed there. But here's another thing we learned through research, is below that bluff where we're told this happened, there are no period artifacts that have been found. No period artifacts have been found below this bluff. They've all been found at least about 1.5 miles up the creek from that monument. The artifacts that Dad found were found starting about 2.5 miles up the creek from that monument. And so that's a problem. No artifacts were found right below that bluff. And some skilled archaeologists searched that area meticulously with metal detectors. There's a man named Fred Warner we talk about in our book. He wrote a book called The Sand Creek Fight. And in his book, he went out many times with a man named Larry Fennell over many summers. And Larry Fennell may not be a name many people know, but he's very skilled with an as an archaeologist with a metal detector. And he went out to the Summit Springs site near Sterling and found hundreds and hundreds of artifacts there. And they went out to the Sand Creek site below that bluff, and they did not find anything other than like aluminum, can pop tab lids, and they found barbed wire and fence staples, and they just never did find any period artifacts. And here's an excerpt from Warner's book. Quickly, I found absolutely nothing except a few junk items, tin cans and wire. Neither of us had found a single battle relic, Warner said. And that was on page 167 of his book, The Sand Creek Fight. And we have other excerpts of his book we've quoted in our book. And this isn't a one-time quote in his book. This is like every time they went out there, they just didn't find anything. And so once that map was accepted, this actually made that site hopelessly lost, because now this was then used to put that monument there. And once the monument there, that's basically accepted as the spot. And it's important to note, because no artifacts were found below that bluff, another archaeologist independently got involved in the early 1990s, and he contacted my mom and dad, because I'm going to get to here in a second the only connection they have to Sand Creek. But he contacted them, letting them know, because the Bowen family owned land on Sand Creek that actually had about 7 miles of Sand Creek going through the ranch. My dad's grandparents bought a ranch on Sand Creek in 1948, and then his parents bought adjoining land in 1949, and that then made there was 7 miles of Sand Creek going through the ranch. And so this independent archaeologist contacted them in the early 1990s to let them know he'd been doing research on his own, and he came to the conclusion that the monument was not marking the right spot, but he thought it was further up the creek on Bowen land. And so some other independent groups got involved, and they decided to have some helicopter searches, so they would fly over and look for other bends and trails and things that might match that George bent map, because they're all still following that map as their big clue. But they flew over, they landed on the ranch, they searched at a spot, and they didn't find anything there. But my parents, over the next couple years, they kept just kind of chewing on this, because again, no artifacts found below that bluff. Generally, no bullets, no battlefield, right? So you're going to find period artifacts where there was activity. That would only make sense. And so they decided in 1995 that they would conduct their own research and do their own search on their own to find the lost, what they would eventually call the lost Sand Creek site. So the only connection that Dad has to Sand Creek is that he grew up there. We don't have any ancestors from Sand Creek. We don't have a dog in this fight at all. We're just sharing history and sharing what he's found. We're not in this to retell the Sand Creek story, but it's important to know the story that the artifacts tell, because they tell a very clear story. And when he meticulously, when he found an artifact, he would get the GPS coordinates and take a photo of them. So you can pull these up on like a Google Earth map, and you can see a picture of how scattered things were. This wasn't in one clustered, congested area. This was scattered over several miles, which tells us a very different story than the traditional story tells us. So that story the artifacts tell is very important. So after they started doing their own research, they started, everything was kind of slow. Mom was the researcher though, and Dad was the archaeologist. So what they decided is if they were going to do their own research, they needed to have a plan. And so they decided that they needed to, 7 miles of Sand Creek going through their ranch is a lot. So they needed to be able to narrow things down for where to search. They decided the only reliable source would be an eyewitness source. Anybody that could talk about what the land looked like, what anything might look like, that would give them a clue where to search. Because I want to just kind of paint a visual here, because he's going to be searching on Sand Creek, 7 miles of Sand Creek, going through the family ranch with a metal detector coil about the size of a dinner plate. That's a monumental project. That is absolutely monumental. So they needed to have a plan to narrow that down. So they read eyewitness accounts, and this goes back, I was actually in high school when this started, and I would come home from school and Mom would be reading a book from an eyewitness and Dad would be taking notes, and he would take those notes and he would learn something like, an eyewitness might say something like, where the creek banks were 200 miles wide. Well, he's thinking, okay, that does not match over by where the monument is, but there are places on our ranch where in fact the creek banks are 200 miles wide. So little things like that. 200 yards, 200 yards wide. So, yeah, 200 yards wide, but that only matched places on their ranch. That didn't match, and it does not match over by the National Park Service site. So he would be able to narrow things down by what eyewitnesses said. And because he grew up there, he had a unique advantage. He knew every trail, every creek bend, every bank. He knew this land like the back of his hand. It was literally his backyard. That's what he did when he grew up, is he went out onto Sand Creek and explored. Nobody knows this land better than him. So when it came to searching, there's really nobody else would have this type of an advantage. And so most of the time he went out by himself to search. There were a few times I went with him to search, probably helped collect and find about 5% of what he found. He had a friend from Lamar, has gone out many times, Joe Harbert, that's gone out many, many times. They found a lot of cool finds. We have an entire chapter about Joe in our book, and one of the a really important find they found together, and some fun stories about Joey going out there and searching. But the first couple years was really slow going. 1995 was really slow, just kind of learning to use a metal detector. 96, a little bit more of the same, but by 1997, things really started to pick up. And he started just finding piece after piece, and it's important to note that every piece he found was an individual dig. And every artifact he found, none of them were very deep. They're all about 2 to 3 inches deep. Nothing was very deep.
And this was all before the National Park got involved.
Yes, sir. And we get into this also in our books. So nothing was very deep. He documented the coordinates. In fact, he actually went to the NPS once they got involved, and my mom and dad let them know about their discovery. Again, they had GPS coordinates. They had it well documented what they had found. They had their research and discovery notarized. They had it documented before they even had met with or the National Park Service became involved. But once they became involved, they met with NPS representatives. We talk about it in our book. They let them know about what they had found, and they were said, okay, they were told, all right, yeah, this is great. We'll certainly give you credit for what you have found. You'll have to read that in our book to know who made those promises, if those promises were kept, and kind of how that's going today. But what we learned through research and discovery, there's a lot of books written about Sand Creek. What we learned about is that most books written about Sand Creek do not cite eyewitnesses. In fact, most books about Sand Creek don't cite any sources at all other than a previous book written about Sand Creek. So it's like this cycle that goes on and on about, they're just citing the most, another book about Sand Creek, and there's no eyewitnesses source. I can't answer as to why. I can't answer that, but all I know is that they're often not cited. And so it's important to note, our book, we only cite eyewitnesses, period documents like the George Bent letters or period newspapers, 1860s newspapers, and eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses are our key source in this book. And it's also a first-hand account of discovery. First and foremost, that's what the book is about discovery. That's what we had learned through books. Most of them don't cite eyewitnesses. But here's an important question. If there was a court trial Here's a question. What's more important, hearsay evidence or physical evidence? I would hope it'd be in unison. I hope the conclusive agreement would be physical evidence would be much stronger than hearsay evidence. In fact, in court, hearsay evidence is rarely accepted because it's very hard to substantiate and to prove. It's very hard to use hearsay evidence. But here's the thing, the only concrete evidence is physical evidence. And the physical evidence is the artifacts. That's the physical evidence, and they tell their own story. And I'm sure you've all have heard of or have played that telephone game at some point in your life. You tell a story, the first person in line, they're told a line to say, and they tell it to the next person, and then, by the time it gets all the way down the line to the last person, and the last person repeats what they were told, it's hardly discernible what they're telling to how it started. That's a lot of what's happened with Sand Creek over the years. It's much of it is hearsay. Much of it is not, and a lot of the research and a lot of the books that are out there is not based on eyewitness evidence or based on artifacts. The thing about artifacts is they do not lie. Artifacts, they can't lie. They've been sitting under that ground. They were sitting there for, at that point, around 150 years, just ready to be found. And they tell their own story. One thing that's left out of a lot of accounts about Sand Creek is the account of Little Bear. And I'm sure if many of you have heard about Sand Creek, but I'm guessing hardly any of you have heard about Little Bear. We learn about Little Bear in George Bent's letters. Little Bear was a warrior at Sand Creek, and he got up very early that morning at Sand Creek, and he went up. This is before the sun even came up, and he went up across and got up on a high hill to go get his horse that morning. And he looked south toward the lodgepole trail. And when he looked south and he saw this long black line way off in the distance, and this was soldiers on horseback. So we learned from George Bent that from miles away, this camp saw the soldiers coming. And so no doubt Little Bear ran back into the village to let them know that soldiers were coming on horseback, because we believe that this account is substantiated by artifacts, because once the soldiers, and from eyewitness accounts, were told that by the time the soldiers reached the village, most of the Indians had fled. Well, we believe this is backed up by artifacts because he's found multiple running battle locations. These are places where they just scattered. This isn't like in one straight line. It's not in a small congested area. This is a scattered event. And so that lines up with Little Bear's account. That's not even from a soldier, but he saw them coming from miles away. And then we know about the approximate size of the village. They approximate about 500. They counted roughly about 100 teepees and thought roughly about 5 per teepee. So it's upwards of about 500 in the camp. We also learned through research that information that we've learned and been given about Sand Creek over the years is really inconsistent. The count of those killed at Sand Creek on the Cheyenne and Arapaho side, the official count was 69, reported to Major Scott Anthony. He was the commanding officer at Fort Lyon. This is also per sworn testimony in a hearing following Sand Creek, and Major Anthony was also at Sand Creek. And so this is important to note. Now again, we're aware that some other accounts range a little bit. Some other reports range from around 100 plus that were on the Indian side that were killed. Now what's interesting though is that today the National Park Service has it at about 260. George Bent had it in 2 different letters. One was about 137 and one was 160, or one was 130, one 167. So his off was about off by 37 in 2 different letters, and then we go from a range of 69 to 260, and it's really unclear where these numbers come from, because we're just told that's the number with no information to say how they got that count, because after this many years there obviously is not a new count of those that were killed, and so it's hard to know where this information comes from. So we look at that, even at 260, that would be about half the village that would have escaped that day. It's unclear to know for sure, but it does look like at least half did escape. And again, anytime a new number is reported, it's just like it's reported as if it's always been that way. And again, the only written account on the Indian side is from George Bent. You can read a lot about his letters in our book. We cite many of his letters, and we have the citation with the date that he wrote that letter to the historian. It's all cited very clearly, very thoroughly in our book. Also important to know about George Bent is that during his schooling years, he was sent off to Missouri, to the Kansas City and St. Louis years for his schooling years. And when he was done with his school years, the Civil War had begun. And so once the Civil War had started, and he decided that, he was going to enlist in the Civil War, and Missouri was a border state. So he could choose between Confederate or Union. Well, he actually chose to fight as Confederate we believe it's because that the Bent family in Missouri, William Bent's parents, I'm sure you've heard of Bent's Fort. William Bent that built that original fort, his parents owned slaves in Missouri. So we believe that's why George fought as a Confederate. Well, once he was done fighting in the Civil War, and we get into much more detail about this in our book, but he went back to Colorado Territory, and that's when he joins and lives among Black Kettle's village at Sand Creek. And again, he's half Cheyenne, and he's got family in the camp. He's got another half brother there in the camp. And so you get a lot of information from George Bent, who lived as a Cheyenne warrior, and he talked about going on wagon train raids and killing white settlers the summer of 1864. This would be about 6 months before Sand Creek. So he talks very much in depth about his experience as a dog soldier and the things they did to settlers that summer. And at Sand Creek, he said that there's a group of Indians, a lot of them, that ran about 2.5 miles from the top of the village to the rifle pits. That's what he called the rifle pits. And in fact, where we measure, we can come back. I had skipped a slide about our book cover, which you can see there. But we're going to come back, and there's actually a place, and this is important though, I don't know if this is going to work. It's really too faint, but you can see at the top of that yellow line on the front, we have 3 white lines going out. Well, it's important to note that Dad was able to get a hold of, in the early 1990s, old 1930s aerial maps. And when he looked at these maps, he immediately spotted a place called Three Forks. And so this is the spot you can measure down, because again, Bonsall measured down from there to his camp number 2 is 6 miles. Well, in between there, you can see between camp number 2, there's a pinpoint at the very bottom, and you can measure in there, and we have in there the length of the village of where some of this fighting took place, the length of the village. But it measures out to be, when you measure down 6 miles from Three Forks, this actually lines up with this happening on the Bowen family ranch, because that Three Forks is your measuring point. Because you measure down from Three Forks, and you can pull up a map on Google Earth, and you can measure down. You can find this on a Google Earth map. You can measure down, and you find that that from Three Forks it lines up with the where he found the Sand Creek, or most of the Sand Creek artifacts. Some of them go further up the creek, a few miles, and it lines up with where they, above the village, 2.5 miles, where they reach these rifle pits. He found digging tools in places that looked like it would be perfect to be set up as a rifle pit. And it's our opinion that in the days prior to Sand Creek, because George Bent in the Civil War would have learned about these rifle pits. So we believe that he helped them dig them ahead of time. Because in one letter, he talked about one pit being big enough for 19 or 20 people to get into. Now, his account in his letter says that they ran 2.5 miles that morning, and they dug the pits that morning. That's a big pit. Even with a several mile head start, those soldiers are going to be closing in, and you could get 2.5 miles, even if they get on horse, that's going to be tough. And when he talks about that they ran, we don't know if they're on foot. That's hard to think that they ran on foot 2.5 miles. We believe it's likely that they got on horse, that they had horses, and they got about 2.5 miles up the creek to their pits, because we believe that they had dug these pits so they could move their camp further up the creek in the spring and be ready for a springtime fight, because they did not like to fight in the late fall and into the winter. They like to do their fighting in the spring and summer. And so there's a place actually on the part of land he has today where it's perfect for rifle pits, and it's where he found digging tools. And you can, when you look from these pits, you can see where these pits would have been. You can see for miles. You would be, and nobody, and from the other way, you can't hardly see into them at all. It'd be a perfect place to set up. But why we're not sure why he says they ran, why we think that might be on horse, because oftentimes in his book, in his letters, he doesn't use a strong enough word. One time in a letter, he said that dog soldiers caused mischief. Well, okay, if I read that and that's all I read, that doesn't sound bad at all. Mischief sounds like Dennis the Menace type stuff, run through, let their horses go, and, kind of just be kind of maybe be rude, maybe turn some stuff over. But here's the thing. In another letter, we found that George Bent said that tornadoes cause mischief to towns. Well, I don't think any of us, if we were writing a story about a tornado, would use the word mischief. I think we'd use a much stronger word, maybe destruction. Might be a better word. Mischief kind of misses the mark, and I think part of it, we don't know about his education, what kind of education he received in Missouri. We really don't know, but oftentimes he didn't use a strong enough word, because we know now by talking about tornadoes and using mischief for both, we know that dog soldiers, in fact, did cause destruction, because he talked about killing settlers and young children on these wagon train raids. So that's very interesting. Interesting to note. And the George Bent letters, there's a lot of them in our book. And so that's just a little bit about George Bent. And so it's important to come back to that what we learn about with Sand Creek, all of our conclusions are based firstly on artifacts, and then also based on eyewitness accounts which line up with where artifacts were found. It's important to note that at Sand Creek, there's also a soldier that was killed in a brutal way. His name was Robert McFarland, and he actually had his gun jammed in his chest, and this was at Sand Creek. We talk about this in our book, and in fact, Dad believes he found the spot where he was killed, based on the artifacts that he found and based on the account. And so another person that's very important to our story is a man named Butch Kelly. He's here today. He's out right in the hallway. And when you stop to look at artifacts and get a signed book, visit with him a little bit. And when you get our book and you read, you're going to read about the most important artifact that Dad found. And I'm going to close with an excerpt here. I think that's kind of one thing you'd probably like to hear is an excerpt from the book. So this is about Butch Kelly. Butch Kelly visited a month later to look at bullets and other artifacts I found. Butch is a local historian and an Indian Wars cavalry reenactor. He portrayed a soldier in Son of the Morning Star, a TV miniseries about George Custer and events prior to the Little Bighorn. He looked at a cavalry carbine swivel from a carbine belt, some spurs, a bit, and 3 or 4 things that could be identified as military, he said. Is there anything else? Butch said after looking at hundreds of artifacts. Wasn't this enough? What more could he want? I had some 5-gallon buckets full of things like barbed wire, fence staples, round nails, and even a hubcap from a Model T Ford. Well, there was a piece of cast iron on the dash of my pickup. It didn't seem worth mentioning. I thought about putting it in my bucket of junk, but I didn't know for sure what it was, so there it stayed. And it sometimes bounced awkwardly, hitting the windshield. I went to get it. There were some threads in it that could have had something like a pipe screwed in it. I handed it to him, thinking it was worthless. Do you know what this is? I had to admit that I didn't. I thought it could be a broken piece of a windmill weight. The old windmills had counterbalance weights instead of tails that are common on them today. Some of the early weights were ornamental and looked like barnyard animals like horses, pigs, or cows. Some were just simple round balls. Perhaps the threads were where it screwed into the windmill. I'll tell you what this is. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. I was not prepared for what he would say next. Okay, the rest of that isn't in the book. You'll have to read and hear about.
You dirty dog.
And you'll have to, that story, it does finish in the book with what was found and identified. It is in the book. So I hope you guys will enjoy reading this. Please stop and look at our artifacts. I thank you all for coming today. And again, come visit with us, look at artifacts, get a signed book, and thank you again to Kent for having us today. It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you.